Hi, it's Hertzog. I'd like to welcome you back to the Social Club, my analog digital hybrid studio. Quick question. What do you do when your interface runs out of inputs and outputs? Do you get a new interface? Or can you expand that interface using its current connectivity to add another 8 inputs and outputs, or to use that expander interface as its own standalone 18 in, 18 out interface unit? 32-bit converters. Some of you already know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the solid-state logic Alpha 8. The Alpha 8 is allowing me to incorporate a bunch of hardware that I have in my racks here, but isn't super easy to incorporate into a DAW session. But now it is. So what do you do when your interface is maxed out, but you want a way to incorporate your hardware as inserts in the DAW? And as a bonus, you'd like to use that 32-bit amazing conversion chip to be able to A/B existing mixes while you're in your analog setup. Let me elaborate a little on that. When I'm working on mixing and mastering a song in analog, there wasn't an easy way for me in the past to be able to check the rough mix in the session. It wasn't always easy for me to compare what I did previously with what I was currently working on. What this allows me to do is use 2 of the channels on the Alpha 8 as extra conversion. I set it up in Cubase as an extra bus. I route the rough mix to that bus. And then whenever I solo it, it's coming out of the Alpha 8 conversion. And it allows me to quickly check it back and forth with what I'm currently working on. I'm comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. At matched monitor gain, that's important. Because if one's slightly higher, it's going to sound higher. And that's going to throw your opinion, because typically we tend to go for the louder signal. If all things are equal and one signal is slightly louder than the other, our brains tend to choose the louder one. That's why the loudness wars started, you know? But this saves me from having to bypass a half dozen plugins and change routing just to be able to check a rough mix. So like if I was to just solo that rough mix in place in my current hybrid setup, it would also be routing that audio out through the compressors, through the inserts in the solid state logic Sigma. And I don't want that extra processing applied. I just want to hear the clean file from what printed in last session. This allows me to do that. This allows me to hear back that session without ever leaving my existing workflow. It's a simple solo, unsolo kind of thing. And I love it for that. I have the stereo outputs from the Alpha 8 that I use for monitoring hooked into my monitor controller. And I can literally switch between input 1, which is the Orion, to input 2, which is the Alpha 8. So this gives me a quick, easy way to check a rough mix against my analog chain, see how much of a change is happening, what's being affected, how is it reacting differently. And I can do all that without having to repatch things through a patch bay. In fact, this eliminated my patch bay. I was using the patch bay before to incorporate my hardware with the solid state logic Sigma. The easiest way to connect an Orion to a Sigma is DB25 connectors. It's easy. 8 channels per cable, right? So 1 through 8, 9 through 16, 17 through 24, 25 through 32. Those are all going through 4 cables. So I have 4 cables in, 4 cables out. So I'm using 8 DB25 cables just to connect the interface to the mixing console, right? And so those DB25 connectors make it very easy to connect the interface to the console. And it takes the outputs from the console and puts them back into the interface so I can print mixed stems in their mix position. Perfect for the artist to hand off when a song's finished, right? But the dilemma there is that leaves me no extra I/O to deal with hardware units that I want to use, right? Like I have a Lintec EQ, I have 2 Lin 76s, I have a couple of Lexicon reverb modules that are all outboard gear, and I would love to be able to incorporate those into a session. The way I had to do it before and the way SSL recommended is taking those hardware units and inserting them in the signal path between the outputs of the Orion and the input of the Sigma. But really what I was doing is I was taking the outputs of the Orion, running them to a patch bay, and then running the equipment to the patch bay, and then patching in whichever equipment I wanted to use on whichever channel. But I didn't have enough room on my patch bay, and I didn't want to have to route all the audio through the patch bay, because I don't know if that patch bay is losing a little bit on the way through. You want minimum connections, right? That's your goal. You really want the least amount of connections possible in your audio chain, right? Less chance of gremlins popping up in your audio signal chain. So enter the SSL Alpha 8. 8 in, 8 out via analog. Another 8 in, 8 out via ADAT. Another stereo, left and right, in and out via SPIDF. So that allows us 18 channels over USB if we want to use the Alpha 8 as its own standalone unit. I like the flexibility of this a lot more. And I'm going to take those 8 stereos ins and outs and incorporate the first 2 as my monitoring channel. And then I'm taking 3 through 8 and I'm hooking them to different bits of analog gear. So I'm using this as a stereo monitoring setup, and simultaneously I can use it as the Lintec, 2 of my Lin 76s, and 2 of my Lexicon modules, 1 in stereo, 1 in mono. But that fills out all 8, and it allows me to use all of this gear simply by adding the Alpha 8. Now, this also has its own clock, but I can also slave it to my existing clock. So what I really like now is this gives me a third option for clocking here at the Social Club. My main clock, the one that I reach for 9 times out of 10, is the Dangerous clock from my Convert 80 Plus. I use that as my master clock for the studio. I slave the Orion to it, and now the Alpha 8 slaves to that. However, if I want, I can take the clock signal from the Alpha 8 and make that the master clock and slave the Dangerous and the Orion to it. So it gives me options that I'm going to continue exploring. I haven't messed with the clocking a lot. I tried it out just to make sure it would work. It did. It does sound slightly different. I would say it sounds somewhere between the Dangerous and the Antelope. The Antelope does sound like overly digital to me, even though it's supposed to be extra analog. The Dangerous sounds the most analog to me and the most natural, which is why I reach for it, and that's my main clock. The SSL Alpha 8 clock is somewhere in between. I don't know if it's a Goldilocks zone or not. We're going to find out with time. But I do like it. Something else here that is very helpful is different input and output operating levels for your gear. So since I'm using different gear all mixed together with the Alpha 8, what the Alpha 8 allows me to do is set the operating level per channel at +9, +18, +20, +24. So depending on what kind of gear you're pairing it up with, you have tons of headroom and the right operating level to make sure that your gain staging stays exactly where it's supposed to be and nothing gets weird making the round trip. There's also a very nice headphone jack right on the front of the unit. Don't have to be fiddling around in the back, nice volume control next to it. And there's 3 impedance levels that you can set in the settings depending on what kind of headphones you use. If you're using low impedance or high impedance headphones, you can adjust the settings so that you're getting the optimal signal. So I do really love having a dedicated stereo in and out that I can check previous mixes or rough mixes against the analog chain in real time. That's invaluable because if I'm going in and say I'm just adjusting the bass on a song, right? Client's happy, but they just want an adjustment on the low end. If I can A/B directly while I'm in the session, I'm making much better decisions, right? Because I'm hearing everything precisely what's changing from the previous version to this one. Because if they're happy with everything else, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. As always with ADAT, your sample rate dictates how many channels you get. So if you're using 44.1 or 48 kilohertz, I always use 48 kilohertz, you're getting your 8 channels. If you're going up to 88.2 or 96 kilohertz, you're going to have those channels. Which means if you had 8, now you'll have 4, but you'll have them at the higher sampling rate. I operate my DAW in 48 kilohertz. I find it to be the most effective for what we're doing. And a lot of other big engineers are using 48 kilohertz. So the 96 kilohertz is usually just bigger file size, and you're not really gaining that much. You can utilize oversampling inside the plugins to mitigate any of the potential downsides of working in 48 kilohertz. So I clock the Alpha 8 to my dangerous Convert 80 Plus clock, and I'm loving how it sounds. The conversion chips do sound a little bit different, even using the same clocking, which tells me that, yeah, they're not the same chip. It is a different DAC, and I can hear that. But the point I'm making is all of the interface units have to be locked to the same clock. Otherwise, you're going to get clicks and pops and all kinds of weird things that you don't want in your signal chain. All your clocks have to be synced to the same time. As I mentioned, you can set your individual channels to match the gear you're connecting to. My Sigma and most other Pro gear can take plus 24 dBus. I need to know that I'm operating with the right gain staging in place. So now let's go into the DAW and let's see how I can take the SSL Alpha 8 and use it as my digital patch bay to incorporate my hardware units into the DAW as inserts. Okay, so I pulled up my VHXRR song Ava from the Ex Machina movie, and here is the track that we record back in. So this is the track from the previous session. Now, if I wanted to solo this before, and we look at my connections, and you can see that I have my 16 stereo channels. The Convert 80 Plus is the other input here, right? So if we go to the outputs, I've now added the alpha monitor, because before all my analog outputs were spoken for. So I had no easy way of monitoring back what was previously recorded, because when I'd solo it, it would still be monitoring the Sigma, the compressors of the Sigma, the Convert 80 Plus, you know, the transformers in there. That was all getting processed, and I was hearing it. By doing it this way, it's just way easier. I'm comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, because what's playing back is untouched. So that was important to me. But moving on, let me show you how the external effects work. It's another tab over here, and you can see I'm sending out on the Orion 37, coming back in on the Orion 37. Now, the Orion, like I said, only has 32 analog ins and outs, but it has 16 extra channels of ADAT, and I'm using 8 of those channels of ADAT to pair with the Alpha 8 to be able to use these hardware units as their own inserts. So what does that look like in the DAW now? Well, let's look. We'll come over here, and here's the Lintec. Here's the Vox, the Lin Vox, the Lin 76 that I'm using on the Vox. We can measure the delay on them. There we go, 160. Easy peasy, measure it. 162, 162. All right. So now if I wanted to, the only insert that I'm not currently using is the Lin 76 I usually use for the bass. So I'll come over here to my bass channel and I'll start typing Lin. It'll show me that the Lin 76 bass is an external plugin that's available. I'll click it. And now that is over my bass channel. Let me measure the delay. Boom. Everything's in sync now. 1.62 milliseconds. Bing, bang, bong, betty boop. And this allows me to adjust how hard I'm hitting the hardware by adjusting the send gain and the return gain. I'm having it come in hot. But this is how I love to use these things. And the beauty of having them as hardware inserts is I can literally just drag this over to this channel if I want. And now it's processing this channel, not this one. I didn't have to patch any physical gear, nothing. It's all just connected through here, and it's as easy as calling it up as I need it. So, what does SSL mean by 32-bit converters? This can get a little confusing, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. There is a difference between 32-bit integer and 32-bit floating point. This is using 32-bit integer, not 32-bit floating point. What does it mean in plain English? Well, it means the conversion chip runs with a very high internal conversion with modern noise shaping, which translates into huge usable dynamic range. Very low distortion. I mean, we're talking into the millionth of percentile on distortion here. And so on paper, the Alpha 8 has 120 decibels of dynamic range on input and 123 decibels on output. I have 123 decibel dynamic range going out to my monitor controller. That's amazing. Very low noise. So let's do the reality check, right? You know, I think the highest a human can determine is 140 decibels dynamic range. And that's literal vacuum of space silence all the way up to, you know, 140 decibels, which is almost, a rocket taking off. But what it does end up meaning is that the converter architecture has enough bandwidth that your low-level details aren't being lost on round-trip conversions. You're not losing your micro details. They're staying intact because the dynamic range and detail is there in the converter chips. Because these are line-level paths with operating signals up to plus 24 dBu, the converter chips aren't your bottleneck. Your gain staging and your analog gear are actually going to be your bottleneck. So set your Alpha 8 to plus 24 dBu when appropriate, and you'll keep your noise floor way down, and it will preserve that transient punch. The 32-bit converter platform isn't a buzzword here. It's why my rough mix path and my analog returned audio null so closely. It's why the inserts feel transparent when I'm not asking the analog to color things. And that transparency is what lets me make quick, fast decisions comfortably and with confidence. I do like that this has 8 TRS inputs and outputs. It makes it super easy to pair with my analog gear. The plus 24 dBu option allows me to stay consistent with the Sigma and other Pro outboard gear. And the word clock in and out keep things very flexible. Now, you can receive the clocking information in the Alpha 8 through ADAT, through SPIDF, through word clock, through USB. So there's various ways where the word clock can be transferred from interface to interface. I'm using the BNC word clock inputs and outputs because that's how I have my chain cascaded. So one of the things that you do have to consider when you're dealing with outboard gear is the latency, right? Like how long does it take for the musical signal to go out, hit the analog gear, get processed, and route back into the DAW? What this does is it allows Cubase to process the audio slightly ahead of time and then resync it up so that as it folds back in, it's lining up perfectly with everything else in the session. These DAWs are very good at latency compensation. And so you can just hit a button, run the round trip test, and it will tell you exactly how long it took and compensate accordingly, which is what you want. Okay, so I just wanted to make a pros and cons list for the Alpha 8 here. So here we go. In the pros column, it has an amazing 32-bit conversion chip. That sounds fantastic. It has incredibly low distortion. I'm talking into the millionths percentile. Flexibility with clocking. I've been experimenting with it as my master clock, and so far I'm really loving the results. The Dangerous is still my rock solid go-to steady, but I'm learning this one and I'm really enjoying it. And I've printed a couple new mixes with it. Another pro is flexibility with routing. There's a bunch of flexibility with routing of how you set up the outputs. It's great if you only need line level signal inputs. If you need a preamp, you're out of luck, but if you only need line level, this gets the job done. The independent channel gain staging to match to each individual piece of gear is phenomenal. I like that it allowed me to expand my existing interface, but still use my interface as the sound card. It also functions as a standalone interface, so this could be your only interface if you choose that. There's selectable sensitivity for the headphones. And the last pro I'm going to put on this list is it makes jumping into adding your analog rack gear into the DAW as easy as possible. Really does a phenomenal job with that. And now, unfortunately, let's get to the cons. Here are the cons as I see it. Switching between the DAW and the analog outputs is somewhat cumbersome. It's what I need to do most often because I use it in one way when I'm in a session, and when I want to use it as the sound card on my computer, I use it another way. And switching back and forth between the two, sometimes I forget, and then I'm like, why aren't my inserts working? And then I realize, oh, I have to switch the Alpha 8 over to the other output mode. And it's a couple button presses. It's just kind of annoying. This isn't good for you if you need preamps. There's no preamps included here. It's all line level inputs. I wish there was a better display. I think a better display would have made the settings easier to use. Here, it's still a lot of referring back to the manual. And the last con I'll put on here is there are more cost-effective options available that do similar things, but I don't think there's anything else at this price that can do it as good as this does it. So do with that what you will. So why do I go to all this trouble? Why do I do this? Why do I use the hardware gear? Isn't it just as good as using a plugin? Look, I love both. I love plugins and I love my hardware gear. I think that they have different uses, right? That's why I love running a hybrid studio. I don't like having to go, oh, I'm team analog. Oh, I'm team digital. I'm team hybrid. I think that if you're really using your brain and trying to be smart, you understand that analog isn't always the answer. You also understand digital isn't always the answer. In the box isn't always the answer. Out of the box isn't always the answer. Answers change. And they change depending on circumstances. So if you analyze your circumstances and you come to your... Oh, Ralphie's over there. Big sigh. I don't know if he agrees. You know, plugins are recallable. Simple. Easy. Open the session, everything goes back to normal. The analog gear you have to reset. But it gives me something that I haven't found plugins have been able to fake yet. There's plenty of plugins that get close and they sound good. But there's something in that front to back dimensionality and depth that is missing to me still. So the cost benefit on this thing, to me, it's pretty good. For less than $1,000, you can add 8 channels of SSL conversion and clocking to your studio. And it could be your only interface if you want. And normally it's only $899. $899. However, right now, I think till the end of September 30th, I think, the sale is running at Sweetwater. You can get the unit for only $799. I purchased this at the end of June. My Sweetwater rep was kind enough, Ryan, shout out to Ryan Murray. What's up, Ryan? Ryan was kind enough to refund back the extra $100 since the item went on sale. That's why I like Sweetwater. They know what their customers want and they help out, you know? So I ended up getting this for $799, and I got to tell you, it is worth every penny of that. $100 per channel for SSL conversion and in and out at plus 24 dBUs. Get out of here. It's too good. For a while, I was looking at the Ferrofish Pulse 16 because I thought, you know, that'll give me 16 extra channels. But this came out, it had the 32-bit conversion chips, and I liked it. So I went for it. I went with the SSL. But if you don't want to spend as much money and you want to double your input and output and do the same kind of thing I'm doing, check out the Ferrofish Pulse 16. And thanks for coming along and watching. I also want to send a shout out to my partner, Aaron, in Majestic Phoenix. Majestic Phoenix is our new musical project. Currently, all our songs are instrumental, but we are working with some new vocalists, and our new songs will be coming out later this fall. But we've dropped 3 singles so far, Crystal, Drip, and Drop. Aaron and I met over 25 years ago at the Art Institute of Philadelphia, and we became instant friends. We've maintained our friendship over the years, and starting in 2025, we started making music together. So very excited. Check out Majestic Phoenix. I hope you'll like it. You can also check out VHXRR, my other musical project that I have with vocalist Rob Rowe from Cause and Effect. We have a new EP that will be coming out later this fall. Keep an eye out for that as well. And I think that should do it. So until next time, this has been Von Hertzog from the Social Club.